Good morning.
3/4?
2/3 is fine too. All right. In this week's parsha, we start off reading the negotiations between Avraham and Ephraim and the Bnei Ches, and Avraham trying to acquire a burial place for his wife Sarah.
Amen.
In Parshas Kiseitze, in Parak Chaf chapter 21, verses 22-23, it talks about somebody who is being hanged to death by the high court. And in that context, there's a mitzvah. Well, he's actually not hanged to death. He's hung after he dies. He's put to death by skila, and then they hang him. And then it says like this: you shall not. In Yiddish we have a word ibernechtig. I don't know, that means to overnight. Yeah, I don't know that there's an English word for that, but it means you shouldn't leave it overnight.
It's like the kugel.
Yeah, the overnight kugel, that's right. So, you shouldn't leave the corpse, the cadaver, on the gallows, on the tree. Because you shall bury him on that day. Now, you note, as we often have in the Torah, is a double expression, ki kaver tikbareno. We usually translate it as you shall surely bury him, or you shall surely whatever it is. Okay. So, technically, in the terms that we're used to thinking of negative commandments and positive commandments, we have here both. The corpse shall not be left there overnight. And there's also a positive mitzvah to bury him. A negative mitzvah not to leave him on the tree. A positive mitzvah to bury him. Now we turn to the Gemara in Parak Nigmar Hadin in Sanhedrin Daf Memvav and Beis. The Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan teaches in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. How do we know that if somebody leaves his dead? Now his dead in Mishnaic and Talmudic Hebrew, his dead means your relative. If a person's relative is dead, Misha Meisai Mutal Lefanov, a person's immediate relative, what we would say somebody who one would set shiva for, a parent, a child, a sibling, or a spouse, is so. If you are Melin as Meisai, if you leave your dead overnight, how do you know that you are violate the negative prohibition? Talmud Loimar Kikavir Sikbereno. So it says the pasuk teaches Kikavir Sikbereno, you shall surely bury him. Mikan, from here we derived the Melin as Meisai, somebody who leaves the dead body overnight, that he violates a negative commandment. Anyone disturbed by this?
What's the negative commandment?
Oh.
It's a positive one.
He says, how do you know you violate the negative commandment? And he brings a positive commandment. Okay, let's continue a moment. Ikad Amri, an alternative version of Rabbi Yochanan's statement. Rabbi Yochanan Mishum ben Yochai. Remez l'kvura min HaTorah 9. What is a hint or an allusion to the mitzvah of burial from the Torah? Talmud Leimar ki kaver tikberenu. Again, the same pasuk ki kaver tikberenu. Mikan remez l'kvura. This double expression ki kaver tikberenu is a remez, an allusion to the mitzvah to the biblical mitzvah of burial. Now, it's a little bit, a little bit unclear, because when we say remez mikan min haTorah, we're saying it's an allusion to the mitzvah min haTorah. So, which one is it? Is it a mitzvah min haTorah, or is it an allusion? Now, we're not going to really sort of definitively answer that question. I will, however, point out that there are other places that we find the Gemara using this expression remez, and yet the Rishonim paskin that it is a biblical mitzvah. And the one that comes to mind, I actually looked it up this morning, is also Rabbi Yochanan. This one was Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. There it was Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, where he says in the end of Kedushin, remez leyichud min haTorah. What is a remez? What would be an allusion to the prohibition of yichud, for a man to be in seclusion with a woman who is an erva to him, with a woman who he is not allowed to marry, and we learn it out from a pasuk. And yet, even though the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan uses that wording that it's an allusion, nevertheless, certainly the majority of Rishonim understand that it's actually a full-fledged biblical prohibition. So, Okay, so we use the word remes. Perhaps some would understand this to mean that the mitzvah of burial is not a full-fledged biblical mitzvah in this case, but maybe not. Maybe it is a full-fledged biblical mitzvah. Okay. Now, so we started off saying we have this. How do you know there's a negative command? So kikov v'tikberenu. So you could learn pshat, and it seems like Rashi learns like this pshat. That the pasuk has the same pasuk has the negative prohibition and the positive prohibition, the positive mitzvah. Lo yisal lenivlos yalaitz kikov v'tikberenu. Don't leave it overnight. You should bury it. So kikov v'tikberenu has this extra word kikov v'tikberenu, a double lashon. Now the context of the pasuk is talking about somebody who's put to death by the bezdin. So therefore, the pasuk, if you would just read it regularly, the negative prohibition and the positive prohibition doesn't apply to a regular person who dies. It only applies to somebody who was put to death by the bezdin. So therefore we have this double expression, ki kaver tikberenu, which teaches me to apply the entire pasuk, both the negative and the positive, to any person who dies. Okay, I think that's what Rashi's learning. I think that's how Rashi's learning. I'm not 100% sure.
You wouldn't think that would be necessary, right? Like if you have an obligation to respect the dignity of the deceased after a person was put to death.
No, but that could be
everyone else that you should treat respectfully.
Maybe, but maybe fakert, the person who was degraded by being put to death, so because he violated, so. Then it's really embarrassing if his body's left out.
You're making up for it.
Yeah, but we'll have to see soon also what the reason for the mitzvah of burial is. But before we do that, there's a very important Yalkut to read. So this is the Yalkut Shemoni, which has the same statement of Rabbi Yochanan, and it's actually printed on the side on the margin of the Gemara that he has a different reading of Rabbi Yochanan. And he says like this: how do you know that somebody who leaves the dead body overnight violates a negative prohibition? He brings the first half of the pasuk. That you shall not leave the body overnight teaches you for anybody. I say, how do you know that he also violates a positive prohibition? The mitzvah of burial. And then Iked Amri, an alternative version is Remez L'Kvurus Menatorim Menayin Shenemar Tamanoim Kikover or Ma Tamanoim Tikberenu Mekan Remez L'Kvurus. So the alternative version, according to the alternative version, according to the Yalkut Shemoni's alternative version, right? We have the Gemara, which records an alternative version, and then we have the Yalkut Shemoni recording the whole Gemara in a little bit differently. So the Yalkut, the first Rabbi Yochanan says there's a Lois Asa and an Asay. And then he says that there's not a regular positive mitzvah, but there's a hint, an allusion. And again, like we said before, what exactly the status of this allusion is remains somewhat unclear. Now, let's continue the Gemara. Shrei Malka says to Reb Chama, Shrei Malka is a non-Jewish king. And he says, how do you know in the Torah the mitzvah for burial? Ishtik, Reb Chama did not answer him. He didn't tell him anything. Rabbi Yaakov says that this world has been handed over to the hands of fools. He should have answered Shrei Malka to say, Kikover, that we have to bury him. Kikover, the first word is Kikover, that you have to make him an oren, you have to make him a casket, or an argas. Tikberenu, okay, so basically what the Gemara is saying is he should have told him Kikovi Tikberenu. Why didn't Reb Chama tell Shrei Malka that we learn out the mitzvah of burial from this pasuk? So he says no, because the word Kikovi teaches you that it doesn't teach you that you have to bury him. It just teaches that you have to put it away. So you put it in an argas, in a coffin. It doesn't say they have to put it in the ground. How do you know you have to put it in the ground? From the second word, Kikovi Tikberenu. The double expression teaches you that it's not good enough to just bury somebody or put somebody away, so to speak, in a casket. You have to actually put it in the ground. Shrei Malka, he's a guy, he doesn't recognize this type of diuk from double expressions in the Torah, and that's why Reb Chama didn't say anything to him. The Gemara asks a question. Kfura mishum b'zyoina hu. Oh, 1 second. So, no. Kfura mishum b'zyoina hu or mishum kapara. What's the reason for the mitzvah of burial? Is it because of b'zyoina, because of embarrassment? And Rashi says, that it would be an embarrassment that people should see him dead and rotting away. Or is it a kapara that the fact that they lower him down into the ground serves as an atonement?
Just like death itself might, and other,
right.
other ways that we have atonement.
Death itself is an atonement. We'll see later that the disintegration of the body is also an atonement. So the burial process is an atonement.
Atonement bichlal.
Yeah. Atonement for the person.
For
that person.
Just like death is an atonement, so too the burial might be another level of atonement or something.
So l'may nafka 1 second. So what's the reason? So that's the question. The last question is, what's the reason for burial? Is it because it's an atonement for the person, or is it because we're protecting him and the world at large, as the Rishonim explained, from the embarrassment of there being dead bodies around? So the Gemara says, l'may nafka, what's the difference? What's the difference? It's a mitzvah. What's the difference? So he says, if a person says before he dies, don't bury me. So if the reason is mishum b'zyoina, that it's an embarrassment, and again, the embarrassment is not just to him, it's to everybody, to the family, to the world at large. So he has no right to say, leave me here, because that's uncomfortable for other people to have to see that. Right. If the reason for the mitzvah of burial is because it provides atonement, and as Rashi explains, that if the reason is for an atonement and the person protests that I don't want this atonement, then even if you do it, it doesn't help. It's not going to atone for him if he's protesting that he doesn't want this atonement.
Yeah.
Right?
There's also, in terms of not the atonement part, but the bizyona part. Wouldn't it also be the bizayon to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Is that also part of the equation?
The Gemara talks about that, but that's Lagabi, the person who was put to death.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, but it should be similar, right? If you have a body rotting, that's...
yeah, could be.
Okay.
All right. So, L'maisa, the Gemara doesn't answer this shaila. There's a whole shackle of time. The Gemara doesn't answer. The bottom line is the Gemara doesn't answer the shaila of what the reason for burial is, and therefore the Gemara doesn't answer what's the halacha. If somebody says, don't bury me, what's the halacha? The Gemara doesn't answer that shaila. However, the Rishonim explain that the Rashi says the Bible ifshita. So they say, okay, so you have to be machmer. You have to be machmer. It's a suffix surah. You have to be machmer. You have to be stringent and bury him. Now, the fact that they're saying you have to be machmer, the chayra is that it seems to be the understanding that there is a full-fledged mitzvah to bury the person, a biblical mitzvah, and that's why if there's a case of doubt, like here we don't know what the reason is, we don't know if the mitzvah applies in this case, nevertheless you have to be machmer, because suffix deraisa l'chumra. And this is indeed the explicit approach of a number of poskim, that there is a biblical mitzvah to bury. And even though, again, like we saw in the beginning, it's a little bit confusing, we have all these different variant readings of the Gemara, but even though in the context, the literal meaning of the pasuk is to bury a person who was put to death by the Sanhedrin, nevertheless, we learn out from the psukim that there is actually a biblical mitzvah to bury all dead people, not just somebody who was put to death by the Sanhedrin. Now, in the conversation between Rav Chama and Shrei Malka, so the Gemara says that if it would have just said the word kikover, I would have thought that would have been good enough to put the person into an arein or into an argaz, into a box, into a coffin. Now that we have kikover tikberenu, the double lashon, it has to be kfuras karka, has to be buried in the ground. Now, let me read to you a Ramban. This Ramban is in Torah Sa'adam, which is the Ramban's Halacha Sefer. And he starts off by quoting a Gemara Yerushalmi. And the Gemara Yerushalmi lists the last will and testaments of Rabbi. And one of the things is he says, Tehei aroini nekuva la'aretz. My coffin should be made, should be a hole from my coffin to the ground. Pirush, says the Ramban, what this means is, Sheyitlu hadaf hatachtun sheba'arin, they should remove the bottom panel of the coffin, V'yashkivuhu ala haaretz. They should bury him directly in the ground. Shekvuras karka mitzvah, because burying in the ground is a mitzvah. Now again, why is kvuras karka a mitzvah? Well, he doesn't say. I think he's going to say this in a moment, right? But we just saw from the Gemara that from this pasuk kavi tikberenu, you see that you have to bury in the ground. However, what the Ramban's point is that if it would just be from this Gemara, we'll see in a minute, if it would just be from this Gemara, you could put the person in a coffin and put the coffin in the ground. But Rabbi is saying more than that. I don't want you to just put my coffin in the ground. I want you to remove the bottom panel of the coffin so I should be directly in the ground. And then he says, "V'lo tema." Yeah, that you wait 1 second. "V'lo tema mishum chavivus Eretz Yisrael." Don't think that this is Rabbi only said this because he wanted to be buried in the ground of Eretz Yisrael. Which, by the way, that is the minhag today. It's interesting, even by Jews who are not keeping and doing all the halachas, etc. That's the one thing you go to. I've been to funerals, even in unfortunately, even in non-Jewish cemeteries of a Jew, and they'll put in a little pouch of earth from Eretz Yisrael. Yeah? Says the Ramban, no, it's nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. I feel the b'chutz la'aretz. This mitzvah of being directly in the ground applies even outside of Eretz Yisrael. Because the Hashem says to Adam Rishon, you shall return to dust. So return to dust means go as close as possible to dust. Now, the Gemara, as far as I know, in the whole conversation where the Gemara talks about the mitzvah of burial, it doesn't bring this pasuk v'alaf tashuv. Right? The Ramban is introducing this as being the reason why Rebbe didn't want that they should put his coffin in the ground directly. He wanted them to remove the bottom panel. Now, the Lashon of the Yerushalmi is to make a hole. The Ramban says to remove the bottom panel. And he says that it's nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. And similarly, you have in the Chidushi Haran on Sanhedrin, where he also goes through very similar to the Ramban from most respects, and he finishes off by saying, because of the pasuk v'alaf tashuv, that the offer hurufu also take the kind of kuras karka mamish is good. Yeah, a person would fulfill his obligation by putting the coffin in the ground, but it's better to be directly in the ground shaloi behefsuk without the separation of the coffin. This is also the minhag in Grona, which is where the Ran Rabbi Nissim lived in Spain and its surrounding towns. So we see that the minhag in Spain already was to bury without a coffin. And of course, they had nothing to do with Eretz Yisrael. Now, nowadays, in Eretz Yisrael, they take a bury without a coffin. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any place in Chutz La'aretz where they bury without a coffin. To my knowledge, it's usually because of governmental, because of regulations, legal regulations. However, it is common practice, certainly amongst Frum Chaver Kadishas, that there is a hole on the bottom of the aron, like the lashon of the Yerushalmi, ki cover nekuva la'aretz. There should be a hole. Small, I don't remember exactly. I've seen it before. I don't know exactly how old there is a hole. And many have the minhag, including Chabad, have this minhag to completely, like the lashon of the Ramban over here, to completely remove the bottom panel of the coffin. If you haven't been by a funeral, sometimes you'll see some stuff going on. Often that's what's going on. It depends exactly on the design of the coffin, how it's done, but it is done. There's various different ways of accomplishing it, and that the whole bottom panel of the coffin is removed after it's lowered into the ground. Again, the reason why they do it after it's lowered into the ground is usually because of the either legal or cemeteries regulations. Otherwise, right, it's not a okay. 1 minute. Okay, now there's a Ramban in this week's parsha, the same Ramban who writes in Teres Ha'adam that we just said that there's a mitzvah to be buried in the ground, and he explains what you see from this Gemara. Okay, so it's an extra mitzvah to be buried directly in the ground by removing the bottom panel, but just to bury somebody not bury them, just to, I guess, put them away by leaving them in a coffin will not fulfill the mitzvah of kfura. Does not fulfill the mitzvah of burial. If the pasuk would just say ki cover, you would say you fulfill the mitzvah of burial by putting them away. You put them in a coffin. There's no bizyoina, there's no embarrassment. Nobody sees it. It's all done. So that would be fine. But because the pasuk says ki cover tikberenu, this double expression, we learn now that you don't fulfill the mitzvah unless you actually put it in the ground. Now this is the Ramban. This is the Ramban's comment on the Gemara. Now the very same Ramban has a commentary on the Chumash, which Ari is learning. And I don't know if you started Parshas Chayesar yet. But if you look in the Ramban in Parshas Chayisarim, he says that as part of the negotiations between Avraham Avinu and the Bnei Ches, he said to them that if you won't sell me this field, I'll bury her. He's going to bury Sarah in an aron, in a box. In other words, what he means is, I want you to be able to put Sarah in the cave, to bury her, what we call bury. If you're not going to sell me anything, I'll just do it. I'll do it without burial. I'll just put her in an aron. Right. So l'chayra, this seems to present a problem, because the same Ramban has told us that the mitzvah of kvura is to put it in the ground. So how could he say that Avraham was saying that he would, worst comes to worst, he'll just put Sarah in the aron? How does that add up? So here there's an interesting klichemda, and he says like this. He quotes from the Avnei Nezer, the Goin HaKodesh Misochach of the Sochach of Rabbi, the Avnei Nezer. He says like this. The Gemara says in Chulin, talks about the mitzvahs that Goyim do. It says one of the mitzvahs that Goyim do is that they don't sell a human corpse in the etlis, in the meat stores, in the meat market. Right? In other words, they're not cannibals. Right? Well, not just they're not selling it. So the Avnei Nezer asks, I don't understand, why is that a mitzvah? Well, why do Goyim have the mitzvah? It's a mitzvah for a Yid. What mitzvah is a Goy fulfilling by not returning, by not burying the dead, and by burying the dead, or by not selling the human meat in the market? What mitzvah are they fulfilling? Says the Avnei Nezer, after the sin of the Adam HaRishon ate from the tree, Hashem tells him, you will eat by the toil of your hand until you return to the dust, because you were taken from the dust. You are dust and you will return to dust. So the Medrash says, the Medrash says, Hashem says to Adam Rishon, the little bit of dust, the handful of dust from which you were created, is not stolen. You're not stealing it. So you have to return it. So basically the way that Avnei Nezer explains this Medrash is that a person is created from the dust, and his job was to refine it, to rectify it. Now that you've sinned, so you haven't really refined and rectified the dust properly. So you've got to get it back. Now you've got to give it back. So the mitzvah of burial is to give it back. Now he says, now you understand which mitzvah a goy is doing by burial, because one of the Sheva mitzvahs of Bnei Noach is theft. And we know that the Sheva mitzvahs of Bnei Noach are not just literally theft, but it's the general umbrella of honesty and integrity, etc. So B'meila, he says, the mitzvah of burial is that a person who passes away and he may not be 100% perfect and hasn't completely refined the dust, so he has to return it to the dust.
Refine the dust, you said?
Refined. In other words, he make his body holy. His body is dust. He makes it holy. Says the Klechemda that, one second.
Surprised. Wait, sir. I don't understand anything. Anyway, so it's like trying to look more important.
So that's one reason. One reason for burial is that you have to return the dust. Another reason for burial is, like we said before, that it's he brings from the Tetzit, but the point is that it's embarrassing. It's a bizoyon, like the Gemara says, that a person should just be exposed, right? Says the Klichemda, what's the difference between these two reasons? If the reason for burial is just that the body shouldn't be exposed, so then maybe it's enough to leave them in a coffin, they're not exposed. But if the mitzvah is to return to the dust, then it has to actually be buried in the ground. Says the Klichemda, that's the pshat. As far as Sarah Imenu was a tzadikah, Sarah Imenu did refine the dust. So the first reason that it has to return to the dust because it's like theft, that doesn't apply to Sori Menu. And therefore, Avraham could tell him, look, if you don't want to give me a burial, it's fine, I don't mind. Sori Menu doesn't need to be buried like everybody else has to be buried. Sori Menu is good enough for her to be buried, put away left in the box. Yes.
I'm sorry, I missed the concept of theft.
He says that returning, the person is created from the dust.
It has to return to it.
You have to refine it and make it holy. If you didn't do it, at least give it back. I give you my material to make something out of. You don't do the job. Give me back my materials. Right. That's based on Avneinezer's reading of the Medrash. Now, by the way, it's a tremendous chiddush. It's a tremendous chiddush, but there's also a very, very strange Gemara which perhaps we could understand based on this chiddush. The Gemara says like this: when Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, was dying, I'll just read you the English. He said to his wife, "I know that the rabbis are angry at me, so they will not take care of me properly after my death. When I die, then again, we're not going to get into the whole context of the Gemara right now. Lay me to rest in my attic, and do not be afraid of me." Shmuel ben Nachmani said, Rabbi Yonason's mother related to me that Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Shimon's wife, had related to her the following: for a period of not less than 18 years. And not more than 22 years, I laid him to rest in the attic. So the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Shimon's body was in his attic for a period of somewhere between 18 and 22 years. When I would go up to the attic, I would examine his hair. Whenever a single hair would fall out from him, blood would appear in its place.
What?
The blood, if a hair would fall out of his body that had been deceased for 18 years plus, the blood would come out in the place where the hair was. One day I saw a worm that was emerging from his ear. So I became disheartened, thinking that perhaps now he would begin to decay and decompose. But he appeared to me in a dream, and he said to me, "Don't worry about it, the worm is nothing to be concerned about. It's simply a punishment for the fact that one day I heard a disparagement of a rabbinical student, and I did not protest as I should have." Two people came to judgment. They would stand by the gate. One would state his case, the other would state his case, and a voice would emanate from the attic and say, "You are liable, you are not liable." Okay, then there was some other quarreling going on, and basically at some point this arrangement had to come to an end, and he was buried. Okay.
Why did he want to be not buried in the first place?
Because
it doesn't say.
Yeah, it's a long sugya here. He said that they were.
They wouldn't do it properly.
Oh, they wouldn't do it properly. Yeah.
He was concerned that they would not inter him in the burial cave of his father, and in the end, after the 22 years, they did. Okay. So this is as you can imagine, this is a extremely fascinating Gemara and a lot to unpack. But just for the one point that's relevant to our discussion right now is like, what about the mitzvah of burial? How could Rabbi Shimon just allow himself to be there, tell her to just leave him there indefinitely, as far as he was concerned? Yeah. What about surely there's a mitzvah of burial? So the Maharsha over there says that there's two reasons. If you look in the Gemara, we learned before, there's two reasons for burial. We're not sure which one is the reason, but there's two options. Either it's mishum kapara or mishum bizyoina. Either it's for an atonement, or because of bizyoina that it's an embarrassing. So he says, what's the embarrassment? The embarrassment is, as Rashi said, that people see the body decompose. Here, the body didn't decompose, so that wasn't a problem as far as he was concerned. Second of all, it's a kapara, it's an atonement. So he says that even nevertheless, he says the Maharsha says two things. First of all, Rabbi Eliezer didn't need atonement, but secondly, he says there's an idea that mishum kavod hameis, you're allowed to delay. That means, even though, like we said, okay, now I'll leave the body overnight, so you have to make the funeral that very day. Nevertheless, we see that often we don't do the funeral that very day. We wait, and the answer is, as the Gemara explains, mishum kavod hameis. If you need time to procure and tachrichim or family members to come in, or whatever other things that are there for the honor of the deceased, then it's okay to wait. So here it was for his honor, because he wasn't going to be buried for 22 years. He wasn't going to be buried in the cave together with his father. So it was to his honor, and therefore it's okay. But Al Kapanim, based on this medrash that the Avneinezer invokes about Sari Minu, we could say a similar thing about Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon also, that because he was so refined to the extent that Ein Rima V'Silei Shalatis Boy, that his body didn't compose or decay, so therefore there was L'chatchila there was no mitzvah of burial in the ground. It was good enough to be buried just to fulfill the mitzvah by burial in an ardas. Okay.
Wow.
Now, I'm going to move on to the next topic, unless people want to interrupt with some questions.
Was he buried in the cave with his father?
Yes, in the end he was. He got
He
it,
was waiting for.
apparently.
Scary stuff.
You can go to Miron now, it's right there.
And so you would get from this also that if somebody passed away and they hadn't had a proper burial, even if it had been a extended period of time for years or whatever, and the family knew about it or whatever, it would be proper then to
Yes, there are a lot
take
of...
whatever remains there are, or however decomposed it may be, and bury it properly according to halakha. Is that
That's often the case. There's lots of tshuvas from Moshe, from other, about different cases of burial, about mausoleum. Moshe is very, very angry about the mausoleums. He's like, Moshe says you're not even allowed to be buried in a cemetery that has a mausoleum.
Wow.
No,
Even for Goyim.
no, he's not talking about Goy. He's talking about Eden.
Elafer Tashivenu,
Elafer Tashuv.
Elafer Tashe,
Tashuv. Yeah.
Elafer Tashu. That pasuk, wouldn't that apply to non-Jews too?
So that's a question that
I heard somewhere that the story of Rabbi Rashab, when he was
Buried?
reburied, that his body for many
Yeah.
years was intact.
yeah, that we have. That's
by witness.
That's quote unquote. That's documented evidence. So they had to move the Rabbi Rashab. They were Moshe Nefesh. They would have been because basically the communists were going to build a highway. What it was, they were Moshe Nefesh in the middle of the night to move the Rabbi Rashab to a different cemetery, and it was. I could look this up. I could look it up with the details, but it was many years after he died, and his body was completely intact. It could even be that the coffin was intact also. But, yeah, there's eyewitness accounts of that.
Who has an account?
There's eyewitness accounts.
The eyewitness account. So they
Um,
said Zionist or something. Zionist.
Alright, anyway. Let's move on a little bit to the Rambam. So the Rambam becomes very complicated and strange. So, first of all, the Rambam says like this. The Rambam is in the laws of mourning, the laws of Evel. Parak Yud Beis, the beginning of Parak Yud Beis, he says like this. V'im tsiva shaloi yispeduhu. If a person says, don't be masmid me, don't eulogize me, and so you listen to him. However,
You don't have to?
If a person says, don't eulogize, then you listen to him and you don't eulogize. However, if a person does says, please don't bury me, you don't listen to him. Why don't you listen to him? Why do you bury him?
Biblical mitzvah.
Uh-huh.
Biblical mitzvah.
Oh, you said it's a biblical mitzvah. Anybody else? Why should you not? If a person says, we learned the Gemara, I'm not sure if you were here when we read the Gemara, but we read the Gemara. If a person says, don't bury me, why should you not
There's
listen
two
to him?
different reasons why you have to bury the person, either because it's a bizayon to the person, or because of a kapara. So if the reason was for that you can't disgrace the person, right, it would be a lack of dignity to the person. So it doesn't matter if he says not to do it, you would still bury the person. But if it's the other reason, the reason that it's a kapara, the person could say, I don't want the kapara.
Right.
So,
and then if
either we might paskin that's the main reason, but the main reason for burial is because it's a kapara, so therefore.
Or it's a suffix.
Or you might hold. Right, or it's a suffix.
Right.
If it's a suffix, you
So
should
basically,
hold and bury
again,
it.
just to summarize, the Gemara said there's two possible reasons for burial, either mishum kapara or mishum bizyoina. If you say the reason is bizyoina, then if a person asks, don't bury me, we don't listen to him, we bury him anyway. If the reason is mishum kapara, then we have to bury, then if he says don't bury me, you don't bury him. 1 second. Now we saw before, the Ran and the Ramban said, the Rosh, it's a ba'adaliv, so we don't know, so we have to be machmir. Now here the Rambam is passing that you have to listen to him, that you have to be machmir, you have to bury him. So you would expect the Rambam to say the reason is because it's a bizoyin to leave him. You can't listen to him, you can't leave him exposed. It would be a bizoyin to do so, and therefore you have to bury him. That's what you would expect the Rambam to say based on having learned the Gemara. However, that's not what the Rambam says. The Rambam in fact says what you said. He says, Ein Shemelo, you don't listen to him. Shakvura mitzvah, because burial is a mitzvah. Shadama kikovitik bereno, as the pasuk says, you shall bury him.
Right.
Yes.
No, I'm sorry. I'm just listening to it. It's fine. I was gonna say, whatever discussion you had, it kind of that's the answer. Biblical mitzvah, because this biblical mitzvah encapsulates the discussion, prior discussion.
Right. Okay.
I mean,
No,
Even if there's a suffix, then it's machmer. But if there's no suffix, and if it's, I mean, it's still.
So here's how the Lechem Mishnah. Maybe this is what you mean to say, but this is how the Lechem Mishnah. The Lechem Mishnah asks this kasha. The Lechem Mishnah asks, why is the Rambam saying the reason you don't listen to him is because there's a mitzvah to bury? You should say the reason you don't listen to him is because burial is mishum b'jena. Says the Lechem Mishnah, and here remember we started off reading this whole Gemara, which was not clear. There were different readings of the Gemara. It wasn't entirely clear, but this is what the Lechem Mishnah says. He says that the Rambam understands this whole question on the Gemara is according to the Shitta that Remes, according to the reading of the Gemara, that there is no biblical mitzvah according to the opinion of the Gemara, that there is no biblical mitzvah to bury. It's merely a Remes, it's merely an allusion to bury. In other words, what does that opinion hold? That the mitzvah to bury that's explicit Kikovitik is talking about somebody who's put to death by the Bezdin. And in that case, there's a biblical mitzvah to bury him. For anybody else, there isn't really a real mitzvah. It's merely a Remes. So then the Gemara says, okay, so it's an illusion. It's not a real mitzvah. So what's the reason for that? So the B'zayna kapara, and then according to that reason you would listen to him. But that's only according to the opinion that says Remes. If you say that there's a real mitzvah to bury, so then it doesn't matter if the reason is Mishum B'zayna, the reason is kapara, whatever the reason is, like you said, there's a mitzvah to bury. There's a mitzvah to bury. You can't listen to him not to bury him.
Right.
What does the Rambam paskin? Does the Rambam paskin there's a mitzvah to bury, or does the Rambam paskin it's just a remes?
Mitzvah.
So if you look in Hilchas Sanhedrin, the Rambam says, it's in Hilchas Sanhedrin chapter 15, Halacha Ches, the Rambam says, mitzvah sasei likber as kol harugi bezdin b'yom hariga. It is a positive mitzvah to bury all people who are put to death by the bezdin on the day that they were killed. Shanama kikovitik b'renu b'yom ha'om. V'lo harugi bezdin bilvad. Not only is it forbid, not only for people who are put to death by Bezdin, anybody who leaves the dead overnight violates a negative mitzvah, even if it's not put to death. Now, we'll get into more detail of this Rambam in a moment, but for now, says the Lechem Mishnah, you see from here that the Rambam paskins that there's a mitzvah to bury anybody. It's not merely a remes. So exactly what version of the Gemara the Rambam had and how he understood the difference between the various versions, etc., doesn't matter. The bottom line, it does matter, but for the purpose of our discussion, the bottom line is the Rambam says in Hilchas Sanhedrin there's a mitzvah to bury everybody. If there's a mitzvah to bury everybody, it doesn't matter what the reason is. The whole discussion in the Gemara that whether or not, the Gemara says whether you listen to him not to bury him or not depends on what the reason is. That's all according to the Shitta that it's a remes, that it's only an illusion that you should bury somebody. There's no real mitzvah. The Rambam paskins there's a real mitzvah to bury, and therefore, you never listen to somebody who says not to bury him. Yes.
This answers something that was
One
bothering.
second. I think Label wanted to say something. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's fine. He paskins that it's real because it violates mitzvah. What was the reason he was paskining that it's a mitzvah?
Again, I'll read to you this Rambam again. You know what? I'm going to get back to this, so we'll read this Rambam again in a minute. Yes, Ari.
From the beginning, I was very bothered by this whole discussion, what the reason is for the mitzvah. I mean, that kind of violates a principle we have, that the Torah tells you to do something. You don't handle what is the reason for the mitzvah. You just do it. You don't get into there's a concept of lo darshan time and dekra. But if you say what you're saying now, or the Lechem Mishnah is saying, that really there's a difference between a remes to something, but it's not the actual mitzvah. It's a remes from the actual mitzvah to something else. So then you could say, well, what's the reason? Then do I have to do it in all circumstances or not?
Exactly. And I would add, we started off by saying that it's a kal v'chomer. If you have to bury somebody who's put to death, certainly you have to bury anybody else. Wow. Now, I don't think it's an actual kal v'chomer, because if it would be a proper kal v'chomer, then it wouldn't be a remes. A kal v'chomer makes something deraisa, because kal v'chomer is one of the shloshas midas. But that's the idea. How is it a remes? The Torah is telling you there's a value to bury somebody. Right. So even though the Torah only says it explicitly in the case of based in, but that teaches you the value, which is then carried over to any dead person. Now, there's another big problem with this Rambam. And we're going to get back to this halacha now. This Rambam that I just read to you was from chapter 12 of the Laws of Avil, where he says there's a mitzvah to bury shenema kikovitik berenu, which again seems to imply that it's a biblical mitzvah to bury somebody, right? However, there's another Rambam, a mere 2 chapters later, where he says it is a mitzvah shel devreihem. It is a rabbinic mitzvah. To visit the to comfort the mourners, to take out the dead, and to marry people, to accompany guests, and to preoccupy oneself with all the needs of the burial, to carry the body on your shoulder, to go in front of him, to eulogize, to dig, and to bury, etc. All of these are mitzvahs elim divreihem. They're all specifically rabbinic commandments, but generally they're under the biblical mitzvah of ahavta l'recha kamecha of avos Yisrael. So upon him, there seems to be an explicit contradiction between these two Rambams, where in the beginning of chapter 12 of Avil he said that is shanam kukovitik berenu, seems to be saying that it's a biblical mitzvah to bury the dead, and here he says, including here and to dig and to bury, is a rabbinic mitzvah. So which one is it? Is it a biblical mitzvah or is it a rabbinic mitzvah?
Explicitly in the beginning, he didn't say it explicitly.
He says shakvura mitzvah shaneh marki kovitik berenu.
or Shelo Yalin.
No, the Yelo Yalin was in Hilchos Sanhedrin. Again, we have here 3 Rambams that we're looking at. We're looking at the Rambam in Hilchos Avil chapter Perikut Beis, was in morning chapter 12, where he says that you don't listen to him not to bury him because it's a mitzvah to bury shaneh marki kovitik berenu. Then you have in Hilchos, in the 2 chapters later in Hilchos Avil, where he says that it's a rabbinic mitzvah to engage in the burial process. Then you have early on in Hilchos Sanhedrin, where in the context of where he's talking about putting people to death, a person who's put to death, and there he says a positive mitzvah and a negative mitzvah.
Oh, that's Shelo Yalin is the negative.
Yeah.
And you also have Kavortik Berenu, that means that's the positive mitzvah.
Now, so there's a number of different ways of understanding this Rambam. Which, yeah. So,
Interesting.
I mean, you could argue. I mean, what's the exact? I don't remember the exact lashon in that Rambam about the burial part where he says it's derabanan, but there's different components to the burial. There's the actual putting the person in the ground, and then the rest of the process, covering him a certain amount or whatever, and all that other things. Those might all be derabanan and fit into the category of Havavta L'Recha Kamocha.
So what I'm going to present here is 2 different approaches to this Rambam, with also a twist from the Rebbe. So maybe you could even call it 3 approaches. And I think what you're saying ties in nicely. But let's start one by one. First of all, there's a sefer called Gesher HaChaim, which is a quite authoritative, popular sefer on anything to do with the laws of death and burial, etc. Written Gesher HaChaim is authored by Rabbi Michael Tukushinsky, who was a very prominent Rav in Eretz Yisrael. We've discussed him many times, and he lived. He was still around by the establishment of the state. I would probably guess he died in. If I had to guess, I would say he died in the early '60s. But
who's this?
I bet Rav Tukushinsky.
Oh, the International Dateline.
And he's big on the Dateline. He was big on St. Louis Baras. He's big on many of these type of shilas. So he says that actually there's another source that we're missing. We've been discussing Elaf HaToshuv, we've been discussing Kovitik Berenu, we've been discussing all these things. He says you're missing a much more elementary source. At the beginning of Parshas Emor, the Torah says that a Kohen is not allowed to come into contact with a dead body, with the exception of his immediate relatives while he's engaging in their burial. Mm-hmm. Now, implicit in that is that it's a mitzvah to engage in burial. Otherwise, why would we allow the Kohen to contaminate himself? And it's not just allow, we require him to. Right? So therefore he says that there's really 3 different chiyuvim over here. First of all, there's a biblical chiyuv to bury one's own dead.
Based on the last statement.
Based on the mitzvah of the Kohen.
For Kohanim.
Then there's another mitzvah.
From Kohanim.
Then there's another mitzvah that's incumbent upon all Jews, and that is that if a person died and his family are not taking care of it, so then everybody has a mitzvah to bury him, and that is learned out from Kikover Tikberenu. And again, Kikover will teach you only for Haruge Bezdin. The double lashon teaches you that anybody, there's a mitzvah for him to bury anybody. That's all on a biblical mitzvah. What's the rabbinic mitzvah? The rabbinic mitzvah is that even if somebody's already being buried, you have two guys with a spade and a shovel, they're burying him. But what about everything else? What about there should be a lot of people by the levaya? What about a hesped? What about a matzeva? What about all the other trimmings around it? That is the rabbinic mitzvah, which the Rambam talks about in chapter 14.
Making sure the shovel's upside down.
Yeah, and that's the rabbinic mitzvah which the Rambam talks about in chapter 14, which is a rabbinic mitzvah, although it is under the general umbrella of the biblical mitzvah of Avos Yisrael. Okay, that's the Gesher HaChaim's approach. That's Rabbi Michal Tukushinsky's approach. Now, here, okay, first I'll tell you the other approach, and then I'll tell you what the Rebbe has to say. Let me find that. There is a Minchas Asher from Rosh Weiss, and he argues as follows. So I have another 3 minutes.
Oh yeah, I was just making the coffee.
Yeah, we're almost finished. Okay, so he says like this. He says, if you look in the Rambam, he's bothered. He starts off by addressing. If you look in the Rambam, he says, look, you have this contradiction. What are you going to do? And the truth is, I just told you these Rambams over here. But if you look in the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, where is it? Page 3 here. The Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs says, "HaMitzvah Harish Lamed Aleph which is Sivonu Likber Haruge Bezdin, V'hu Adim B'Shar Mesim." Right? There's a positive mitzvah to bury anybody. So there's a mitzvah to bury, a biblical mitzvah to bury, and then he says it's a rabbinic mitzvah. Says Minchas Asher, says Rabbi Shavai, he says like this. That, remember the Ramban explained the Gemara. One second. Ramban explained the Gemara that kikover would just teach you. If it would just say kikover, you would say it has to be in just an aron. Tikberenu, the double lashon is that you have to
bury.
An alternative reading in the Gemara was kikover for the haruge bezdin. Tikberenu is for all dead people. So Rabbi Shavai suggests like this. The Rambam understands the Gemara to be saying like this: for somebody who's put to death by the Bezdin, there's a mitzvah of you have to bury them in the ground. For somebody who wasn't put to death by the Bezdin, the only mitzvah, the biblical mitzvah, is that you shouldn't leave them exposed. You bury them in the aron. You can't use the tikberenu on both sides. So either the tikberenu is telling you that it applies to all dead people, or tikberenu is telling you that putting in an aron is not good enough, you have to put it in the ground. So what you're left with is that if the person just died a natural, was not put to death by the Bezdin, he just died, or whatever, or for any other reason he's dead. Now there's a biblical mitzvah covered, which means that you're not allowed to leave him exposed, but there's no biblical mitzvah to put him in the ground. That's a rabbinic mitzvah. And he says, if you look at the Rambam, it's very interesting that in chapter 12, where he says there's a biblical mitzvah, he just says shakvura mitzvah. Doesn't get into details. But later on in chapter 14, I think this ties nicely into Minchas Asher and into Gesher HaChaim's word. Because in chapter 14, two things. First of all, he's putting it together with all these other needs to carry him and to go in front of him and to eulogize him, which is the point that Rabbi Michal Tukushinsky was making. But then another thing. Before, in chapter 12, he says, Shahakvura mitzvah, burial is a mitzvah. Here he says, V'lachper v'likver, to dig and to bury. If it was just burial as a mitzvah, you could bury him in a box. The rabbinic mitzvah is lachper v'likber, to dig and to bury him, to put the box in the ground. So that's two possible ways of understanding the Gemara. Now, there is a Rishima of the Rebbe. Rebbe's Rishimas notes that the Rebbe, for the most part, it's notes that the Rebbe wrote for himself. He never published them, he never did anything with them, they were just his notebooks. And after the Rebbe passed away, many of these notebooks were published. Now, here, the Rishimas Kuf Chav Zayin and Kuf Chav Ches are notes that the Rebbe wrote on a kuntras from Rabbi Eliyahu Weinberg. Rabbi Eliyahu Weinberg, who was in Berlin, who the Rebbe knew him in Berlin, and the Rebbe received smicha from him in Berlin.
Really?
Yeah, you never knew that?
No.
Yeah. The
Is
Rebbe,
it Yaakov Weimer?
yeah. Mark Shapiro has written a lot about that.
Well, I read the biography. I don't remember that.
Yeah. So Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg wrote a sefer or kunshus on the laws of burial, and he gets into this Rambam and the Lech Mishnah and the whole thing, and he makes some suggestions. Now, and the Rebbe has notes on this kunshus, and the Rebbe is arguing with some of the points that Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg makes. Now, I have to confess that it's quite complicated sugya, and I do not fully understand all the Rebbe's arguments, and I don't fully understand the sugya. But I'm just going to take out one thing from this. It seems to me that what the Rebbe is saying is that the Rambam holds, the way the Rambam reads and the Rebbe gets into all the different versions of the Gemara, etc. But the bottom line is like this. Again, we started off the class, there's two halves of the pasuk. Lo yisol nivlasi alo eitz, ki kaveh tikberenu. Don't leave the body overnight, do bury him. A negative mitzvah and a positive mitzvah. So the Rebbe learns pshat in the Rambam, and again, based on the way Rambam learns pshat in the Gemara, that the negative mitzvah, not to leave him overnight, that applies to all dead people. The positive mitzvah of kikaveh tikberenu, that you do have to bury him, that only applies to harugei bezdin, to people who were put to death by the bezdin. There is no biblical positive mitzvah to engage in burial with other dead people. Now, if you look back, this is the Rambam you wanted me to read again. If you look back in Hilchas Sanhedrin Perek Tezvav Halacha Ches, I'm reading to you the Rambam again. Mitzvah sasei likberes kol harugei bezdin. It is a positive mitzvah. Listen very closely. Is it a positive mitzvah? It is a positive mitzvah to bury all harugei bezdin, to bury all people who were put to death by the bezdin. B'yom harig, on the day they were killed. Shenemar ki kaveh tikberenu b'yom hahu. As the pasuk says, you should bury him on that day. V'loy harugei bezdin mulvad. And not only people who were put to death by the Bezdin, anybody who leaves the dead overnight for no good reason, as Rambam continues to say, violates a negative mitzvah.
To not leave him overnight.
To not leave him overnight. Now, before this, if not for the Rebbe's Rishima, you could sort of kind of read this two ways. It could be that what the Rambam is saying, v'lo harugei bezdin bilvad, that this doesn't apply only to harugei bezdin, is going on the whole halacha, that the positive mitzvah and the negative mitzvah apply both to harugei bezdin and to anybody else, or which I will say, I think that there is, one could read it that way, but another way to read it is no. First, there's a mitzvah say there's a positive mitzvah to bury people who are put to death by the bezdin, and then there's a negative mitzvah for everyone. Now, why there should be that difference? Again, that gets into the intricacies of exactly how we read the Gemara, the different versions of the reading of the Gemara. Now, there are a number of chidushim, of problems with the Rebbe's. So the Rebbe's reading it the second way, that the positive mitzvah applies only to harugei bezdin, the negative mitzvah applies to everyone. Now, there are a number of problems with the Rebbe's reading it, and I think the biggest problem, l'chayra, is that the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos, like I read to you before, says b'feirush.
But it's the same thing.
1 second, what?
In either case, they're not allowed to be left overnight.
And well, what's the differences?
Both categories.
Okay, so 1 second. So so first of all, there's a theoretical difference. There's a positive mitzvah and negative mitzvah, but it could be that the Helena, one could suggest, and again, I don't know if the Rebbe is suggesting this or if I'm suggesting this because I don't understand it fully, but one could suggest that the heter of Helena lichvoidoi, the heter that one is allowed to delay the burial, if it's for the honor of the deceased, is only a heter as far as the negative mitzvah is concerned. In other words, there's a negative prohibition, don't leave the dead overnight. But if you need to do so, because if you leave it overnight, you're going to be able to have techrichim, shrouds. Right. But otherwise not, so then you're allowed to delay, right? Maybe that only applies to the negative mitzvah, not to the positive mitzvah. And therefore, according to this understanding, it would emerge that that for harugei bezdin, you would not be allowed to wait. For a regular person who dies, there's no positive mitzvah, there's just a negative mitzvah, so you're allowed to wait if you're trying to make an appropriate burial, funeral. But for Harugei Bezdin, where you have a positive mitzvah, ki kabir tikbirenu b'yemahu, on the day that he was put to death, perhaps there's no heter of delaying it for his honor. Now, again, the problem, the biggest problem I have with it, again, besides the fact that I don't fully understand all the different girsas of the Gemara and all the meaning the Rebbe is attributing to the different readings of the Gemara. And again, this is not something that the Rebbe explained. This was the notes that the Rebbe wrote to his hand and to himself in shorthand. It's very cryptic, yeah. But in Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam, in the positive mitzvah of burial, the Rambam includes also not just people who are put to death by the Bezdin, anybody, and so does the Sefer HaChinuch, who usually emulates the Rambam. Now, it's not a period. You could still say that the Rambam. Often you have things that the Rambam writes in Sefer HaMitzvahs. Not often, but you do have things that the Rambam writes in Sefer HaMitzvahs, and later in Mishnah Torah he changed his mind. So maybe this is something that the Rambam changed his mind. I just want to finish off that again. We're trying to explain this stira in the Rambam. Is there a positive mitzvah? Is there a biblical mitzvah to bury, or is there a rabbinic mitzvah to bury? Right. So Ari. I'm trying to say, according to the Rebbe's understanding, that the negative mitzvah is for everybody and the positive mitzvah is only for Harugei Bezdin. Perhaps we can also now address this contradiction in the Rambam. The Rambam says in Perek Yudalad that there's a rabbinic mitzvah to engage in burial. That's true of all people. All people, there's a rabbinic mitzvah to engage in burial. In Perek Yud Beis he says that there's that if a person hold on, one more thing. It says that there's a rabbinic mitzvah of burial. What's the rabbinic mitzvah of burial based on? Kikover tikberenu, said the Gemara, it's a remez. Like the Lechem Mishnah said, it's a remez. In other words, it's not just a regular rabbinic mitzvah, it's a rabbinic mitzvah which has an allusion in the pasuk Kikover tikberenu. Right? The Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin said explicitly, according to the way the Rambam is reading that Rambam, that the biblical mitzvah Kikover tikberenu as a full-fledged mitzvah only applies to Harugei Bezdin.
Yes.
The remez of that applies to everybody. Now, so let's go back and read this again. Perek Tezvav of Sanhedrin said there's a negative mitzvah for everybody and a positive mitzvah for Harugei Bezdin. Perek Yud Daled 14 of Eivel said that there's a rabbinic mitzvah to bury everybody. Now in chapter 12, when the Rambam is saying that if somebody says that you shouldn't bury him, you don't listen to them, what does he say? And Tiva Shali Yikava in Shem Loisha Kvura mitzvah, because Kvura is a mitzvah. Shanema Kikavi Tikberenu. Kvura is a mitzvah. Is based on the pasuk Kikavi Tikberenu. Is it a rabbinic mitzvah or a biblical mitzvah? It depends. If it's Harugei Bezdin, it's a biblical mitzvah. If it's a regular person, then it's a rabbinic mitzvah. Which is, but both the rabbinic and the biblical mitzvah are based on that same pasuk Kikavi Tikberenu. So the Rambam in chapter 12 is not getting into whether it's biblical or rabbinic. Right now, all I'm telling you is that if a person says, "Don't bury me," you don't listen to him because there's a mitzvah to be buried based on the pasuk Kikavi Tikberenu. You want to know the exact status of that mitzvah? I'll tell you. Go to chapter 14, I'll tell you that for regular people it's only rabbinic. Go to Hilchos Sanhedrin, chapter 15, I'll tell you that for Harugei Bezdin it's a biblical mitzvah. So what I'm saying is that based on this Rishim of the Rebbe, we have a third interpretation. So we have three interpretations in this Rambam. We had Rabbi Chilmichal Tukashinsky who says that the biblical mitzvah is to bury, and the rabbinic mitzvah is all the pomp and ceremony around it. You had the Minchas Rosh who said that the biblical mitzvah would be enough to just leave them in a coffin, and the rabbinic mitzvah is lachber v'likva, they have to kvura b'karka, they have to bury them in the ground. And then I'm suggesting, based on this Rishim of the Rebbe, that no, that it just depends. For Harugei Bezdin there's a biblical mitzvah, for everybody else there's a rabbinic mitzvah. Both the rabbinic and the biblical mitzvah are derived on some level from the pasuk Kikavi Tikberenu, and therefore chapter 12 tells you that if a person says don't bury him, we don't listen because there's a mitzvah to bury him. In other words, just right, if it would just be for the negative mitzvah, based on what I said before, if it would just be for the negative mitzvah, so the negative mitzvah says lichvoidoi, for his own honor, you could leave him overnight. You need to get proper shrouds, you could leave him overnight. So maybe it would be good enough If he says don't bury him, well, maybe that's his honor. Maybe his honor is don't bury him because he asked not to bury him. So it could be that the negative mitzvah wouldn't apply over there. That's why the Rambam has to invoke the positive mitzvah. That even if he says don't bury me, you still have to listen, because even though his honor might be to not bury him, but there's still a rabbinic mitzvah to bury him based on the pasuk of kikavet ikbireno, whether it's mishum kapara or mishum bezyoina, as the Gemara discusses.
So we would violate his will even if we're going to call it a rabbinic mitzvah?
Yes.
Because we have a biblical mitzvah in the Rambam, but still.
Yeah, we violate. A person can't say I don't want to do a biblical mitzvah, a rabbinic mitzvah.
Yeah, but then can't you handle into the reason then, if you're talking about a rabbinic?
Lav dafka. Again, kavod habrius is when a mitzvah is, when a certain scenario of the mitzvah is kavod habrius, not the mitzvah. Okay, I don't know.
I don't want to compare.
Akabanim here, like Label is saying, it's not a regular Rabbanon mitzvah. It's a mitzvah Rabbanon which yesh remes min haTorah. And again, I said to you before, like the whole thing of remes min haTorah is not so clear that it doesn't mean a biblical mitzvah. Like we said by yichud, yeah, yichud. It's interesting to look up how the Rambam holds by yichud. Wow. And if you look in Hilchos Ishus, in Hilchos Suribiyah, Perek Chav Bey is the last Perek of Hilchos Suribiyah. It talks about yichud. You have a Rambam on your phone?
Yeah.
Open up Hilchos Suribiyah, Perek Sefer Kedusha. Which app are you using?
Rambam Yomi?
Here, give me the phone. I'll find it quickly. I'll go to Allah. Oh, you have this one. Okay. Sefer Kedusha, Hilchos Suribiyah, Perek Chav Beis. Your Rambam text. Okay. The Rambam doesn't say explicitly whether that.
From that you can't have yichud with your mother or whatever. And
here the Rambam says Isa yichud aroyis min pi Kabbalah, that it's a pi Kabbalah, so it seems that it is deraisa, even though the Gemara says remez. So just the fact that the Rambam said that the Gemara says remez doesn't per se mean that it's not a full fledged. It's different. There's some difference. Whichever way you cut it, it's not a regular biblical mitzvah. It's a remez. Again, it's some sort of quasi biblical mitzvah maybe.